The market's been so hot for so long. The number one question people are asking these days are we in a bubble? I'm going to answer that, tell you what I think based on data coming up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? Dylan Donaka here with the Buy Big Island video blog. And the market's been on fire for feels like forever now, but it's really been about 12 months. But with prices rising and inventory low and people buying like crazy, people are asking, are we in a housing bubble? Is this like 2006? And so I'm going to answer that question for you and give you 3 reasons based on data that this market is very different than 2006. And if you've watched me on other shows and channels, I've been talking about this for a while. But I always like to point back at the data and not really go off of what it feels like, right? Because that's what people like to do, is, well, it feels like 2006 because the market is hot. And that doesn't really mean anything, right? Feel doesn't really mean anything. So if we look at the first most important piece of data based on the way mortgages are given out today, is looking at credit scores. So in 2006, $376 billion of mortgages were given out to people with a credit score of less than 620, so not a super hot credit score. Today, there are less than $74 billion of loans being given out to borrowers with less than a 620 credit score. So what does that mean? That means that there's a lot less risk in the market, right? There were a lot more risky loans in 2006 in the lead up to the last housing bubble than there are today. Many of those issues were solved with legislation that changed the way lending standards were structured and has greatly reduced those subprime type mortgages that gave mortgages out to people who probably shouldn't have got them and weren't prepared to pay those mortgages back. And that greatly contributed to the housing crisis and the bubble that we saw a little over 10 years ago in 2007, 2008. So that's a big one. Lot less risk in the mortgage industry and who has borrowed money to purchase homes in this market versus that market. All right, the next thing, we're feeling this across the United States, right? And that is the inventory shortage that we have. And this is simple supply and demand, right? The less homes there are, the more buyers there are in terms of demand, prices are going to go up. And that is affected by the last housing bubble somewhat because the new construction housing market hasn't recovered from the last housing crash. And what I mean by that is, on average, if you go decade by decade by decade, there's about 9 to 12 million new homes put on the market per decade if you go pre-2010. But since 2010, there's only been 6.5 million new homes put on the market. So the new housing supply has greatly lagged the last 50-year average. And so what that has done is further constrain the inventory that's out there for people to buy, which has been driving prices up. So that is a national statistic very clearly that supply and demand is very important in terms of price. And this decade, there's been about half as many homes built in America as there were the previous 50 years per decade. So that has contributed to the shortage of inventory and is contributing to the rising prices. So that's a very different big factor than 2006, 2007, and those years leading up to the last housing bubble. And the last thing, reason number 3 that we want to talk about, is the percentage of cash out refis that people have taken advantage of. And with these low interest rates, we all know that there's been a lot of refinancing. But in the last run up to the housing bubble, people used their homes as an ATM, right? They were refinancing, being given, their homes were way overvalued, so they were pulling cash out of their homes that was already not reflective of the true market value. And then they were spending that money maybe on another home, getting another mortgage that they shouldn't have gotten, invested in another investment property. They could have been buying cars, all kinds of stuff, going on trips, right? People were doing all kinds of crazy stuff with the equity that they had in their homes. So in 2006, there were 89% of people were doing cash out refinances. This year, it's 38%. So it's a lot less, right? There's not as many people who are pulling that equity out of their homes as there was in the last run up. And that is meaning that there's still a lot of equity left in those homes. And I'm going to do another video on forbearance and when the end of forbearance comes, what that's gonna do to the market in terms of foreclosures. But this is a good indicator that people have not maxed out their equity in their homes and pulled that money out and spent it on other things. And so that dynamic is definitely gonna contribute to the fact that this is not like 2006, 2007, 2008. And so going forward, I've been saying for months and months and months now, this is really a natural market. It isn't fueled by the artificial shoddy lending that we saw in the last run up, where people were getting loans that they probably shouldn't have gotten. They were doing stated income loans. There was those no job, no income or assets ninja loans that were out there. All of those lending practices that were very risky, that led to the housing bubble, have pretty much gone away and haven't returned, because there has been new legislation. And so the environment today is very different than it was in 2006. And so, are we in a bubble? We're not if we are, it's not like 2006, it's different. But we're probably not, because we're seeing that a lot of people who are buying today are paying 10, 20, 30, 40% down, or they're not doing 0% down loans. It's hard to even compete in this market with a low or 0% down type of mortgage, because you're up against people with cash or with large down payments. So the market's very different. I wouldn't be concerned if you're waiting for a huge market crash and a bubble to pop and then waiting to buy. It's probably not coming anytime soon, because the market is very different today than it was during the last crash. So if you have any questions, as always, put them in the comments below, or hit me up at dylan@buybigisland.com, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening. Aloha.